chairpersons, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me here. I think I'm a bit of a foreign body here as a pediatric surgeon in a group and room full of gastroenterologists and hepatologists. So what I'm going to do, or what my brief has been essentially, is to differentiate between pediatric and adult acute liver failure. As I said, a lot of the discussion has happened, a lot of the discussion will happen. So rather than concentrate on specifics, what I intend to do is basically have a broad look at the problem and see specifically how the pediatric patient with acute liver failure differs from the adult patient with acute liver failure. So that will be the essential scope of my talk today. It's a cliche, everybody keeps saying this, a child is not a small adult. It bears repetition because it is important. One size doesn't fit all, and hence I think we should look at children in a different way. I very confidently raised my hand when the previous speaker asked the question, because I had the same study listed on my presentation also. And it was just amazing that something that is so much discussed has so many different definitions. So this has been discussed, I think, adequately. I'm not going to go over all of this. However, there is a problem with the definitions in children, essentially because encephalopathy as such is thought to be a late event, and it is also very difficult to specify when actually encephalopathy began in a child. Most children are cranky, and even perfectly normal children seem encephalopathic at various points of time. I can tell you from personal experience. So detecting encephalopathy and saying that from X number of days from the onset of encephalopathy is difficult, and hence using encephalopathy as a very important anchor in diagnosis is a problem. So with this, I think when the pediatric group looked at it, and when the pediatric acute liver failure study group definition came, I think it made more sense, because the problem has gone from a subjective assessment of encephalopathy to an objective assessment of hepatic-based coagulopathy. So you need basically to say that coagulopathy is more important. If you have coagulopathy with this kind of a scale, whether you have hepatic encephalopathy or not, this child has acute liver failure. So if you have an PT of more than 20, INR and more than 2, you don't need to have encephalopathy to label this child as acute liver failure. And this is, I think, an important differentiation, especially when you're dealing with children who at best times are difficult to assess. So to just clarify, I think when I look at it from the pediatric point of view, I think essentially acute fulminant or acute liver failure is a multi-system disorder in which severe impairment of liver function occurs. This may happen with or without encephalopathy. There is hepatocellular necrosis in a patient with no underlying chronic liver disease that has been known. So this, I think, is the broad sort of general English statement of all that is being discussed so far. With respect to the etiology in children, now this is the adult etiology, and this, I think, again was discussed, and the same sort of numbers have come up. More than half of them are acetaminophen induced, and a few others. The unknown is a small number, and depending upon how aggressively you investigate them, this number becomes smaller. It may be relevant to the patient because it might happen in the patient's lifetime. It may not be so relevant from the patient's point of view because it happens subsequently, but still there is a basket of about 15% who we still don't have a diagnosis. Now, if you contrast this with the data from children, this is the pediatric acute liver study group data set, about half of them are unknown. So this is a very, very large number. So we have a group of children here in whom more than 50% we do not know what the etiology of the liver failure is. And there are centers that will do everything and will identify a cause in a given patient at some point during the study period. But at the time when it is relevant to the patient, and when you look at across the group, when you look at a multi-center kind of business, about 48% of them don't have a diagnosis or don't have an etiology in children. The acetaminophen group is relatively a smaller group. There are a whole lot of other things that are metabolic and stuff that we don't see so much in adults, but become very important in children. So if you plot them together, I think this is where the biggest difference comes. The idiopathic variety is a very small number in adults, but is a pretty large chunk in children. Okay, so that is something that is important to remember. I will also allude to a couple of studies that came out from here. I think this was already spoken about. This is a study from Calcutta on children, and they found that of 45 children, an etiology was found in 35. 30 of these 35, that means about 2/3 of them were due to hepatotrophic viruses in various combinations, A, E, and B, in that order of frequency. And they concluded that hepatotrophic viruses are the commonest cause of ALF in children in that particular part of West Bengal. The same data has come out from multiple places, and they all mention the same figures. So in children, those are idiopathic, but there are a significant number that have viral problems also. I think I need to draw a line, I need to draw some attention to the paracetamol issue here, because we are under the impression that we don't see paracetamol toxicity so often in India. But that is changing. Of late, there has been preparations of paracetamol that has come in the form of drops. Traditionally, paracetamol in children was a 125 milligram in 5 ml. So it was a very low concentration paracetamol. Now paracetamol is available in a drop form where there is 100 milligram in 1 ml. And this is supposed to be for newborns and neonates. And this often is given as a syrup. And it is not unusual for us to see children coming with paracetamol overdose because of this problem. So basically younger children under 3, 4, 5 years, we have seen children who have come with paracetamol problems, and a lot, and both of them, about 2 or 3 of those patients were all due to usage of drops in the form of syrups. And this is something that we need to remember because it is something that is happening on the ground today. How do children present? Well, typically it's a well child. He's been very well. He's been going to school. He has no medical problems, no transfusions, no exposure to hepatitis. And he develops what is called an ordinary hepatitis, which people sit on and give other kinds of medication. However, things don't get better. They worsen over a few days. He starts getting lethargic. He starts having hallucinations. Progressively, his neurology worsens. He might have a bleed, and it's that time that they are referred to an epic center. And when they come there is really no doubt. This is a very, very sick child. He's deeply icteric. He's an altered sensorium. He's bleeding from all over the place. So here there is really no doubt about it. And this is a typical presentation. More often than not, this is how a child with ALF presents. Encephalopathy has been discussed, and there is a lot of encephalopathy and various grades. Again, very, very difficult to make out in a child. It is very, very difficult to detect in the early phases. It's very subtle, poor feeding, not suckling, generally not happy child, irritable, not behaving in a regressive manner, sleep disturbances. These are very, very subtle signs, and these are signs that are sometimes difficult to detect and might often require various frequent examinations and somebody who's aware to pick up these things in a child. And that's the whole problem with encephalopathy diagnosis in a small baby. It's been graded, grade 1, 2, 3, and 4, progressively more and more deepening coma, and ultimately starting from slow mentation disturbed cycle to almost decerebrate kind of situation. And you can pick up EEG changes to try and correlate it with the clinical picture. And so it helps you label encephalopathy in children. The principles of management remain the same. However, a few things that are important from the children's point of view I shall highlight. These are important, and these are sort of standard things that will come up again and again. I will not go over them. But there are certain measures that are counterproductive in children. One of them is a liver biopsy, except when you do them transjugular, but doing a transjugular biopsy in a child is not the easiest of things. Liver biopsy does not provide you with any more information than what you have by other means. So liver biopsy is really not a done thing when you have a child with acute liver failure. You don't sedate these children unless they are being ventilated. You must not overcorrect the coagulopathy. There are riders to that. I will talk about it in the future. And as far as possible, you should not totally eliminate protein. Children do need some protein when you are feeding them, and about 1 gram per kg is thought to be a reasonable balance between overload and depriving them of too much protein. Etiology has been discussed. A few things that are typical in children. Herpes family is known. Herpes simplex virus causing acute liver failure is known. Acetaminophen we discussed. Some of the metabolic diseases are not seen so commonly in adults. They are seen in children, and they are important causes of acute liver failure in children that one must remember. There are immune dysregulation problems like hemophagocytic syndrome, etc., that also present as acute liver failure in children, and these set of causes are relatively less common in adults. So when you see children with acute liver failure, all these things are something that we should think about. Encephalopathy was discussed. Again, how you manage them is again more or less standard. There is a lot of talk about intracranial pressure monitoring in children. Again, it's a difficult thing to do. There is a lot of controversy about it, and we are not sure how much the pressure actually reflects how the functional recovery is going to be after recovery or transplantation, because children's brains are thought to be plastic and they can adapt even if they are subjected to fairly significant injury during the early years of life. Coagulopathy we discussed again. It is important to realize that children are at risk of intracranial bleeds, so it is important not to leave the INR to go up too much. And when do you treat coagulopathy? If the INR is less than 1.7, you don't treat. If the INR is between 1.7 and 2.2, there is no bleeding, no treatment. If there is bleeding, you have to give FFP. And if the INR is more than 2.2, you have to give these children FFP to bring the INR back, because spontaneous intracranial bleeds are pretty common in children when the INR goes high above this level. So you're not aiming for normal INR, you're basically aiming for INR where the risk of intracranial bleeds are low. In desperate situations, other factors can obviously be used. Infections are common. The infection incidence is almost 82% bacterial, 34% fungal, and they are implicated in directly or indirectly in 50% of all deaths in children from acute liver failure. How do children's outcomes differ from the outcomes in adults that was discussed just now? The leading causes of death in children are thought to be these. Cerebral edema is thought to be the leading cause of death in children with acute liver failure, overwhelming sepsis, pulmonary failure, and various other things. Fatal hemorrhage, that is thought to be common in adults, is not so common as a cause of bleeding in children. There are various prognostic indicators, there are various prognostic markers, but again, that is what they are. They are indicators and they are markers, and it has to be applied in the whole clinical picture and scenario in a given child. This is again standard. These are nothing very different. Risk factors from death or for transplantation in children with acute liver failure, age less than 3 years. If you have grade 4 encephalopathy and they arrive earlier, and that's I think what they were talking about the hyperacute failures, they seem to be better than those that have progressed over a short period of time. Other markers of poor outcome and risk of death are serum bilirubins, which are high, INR, and hepatic encephalopathy. What are the indications? When would we indicate or when would we proceed to liver transplant or suggest liver transplant to a child? If there is progressive worsening of coagulopathy, encephalopathy, you will think about transplant if the cause of predicted outcome of transplant is better than underlying disease, and we can say more or less with some confidence that the brain damage that is there is not severe and not of a permanent nature, and this is sometimes very, very difficult to do. You will not offer transplant if the disorders cannot be cured by transplant. Example, a mitochondrial disorder, for example, or a various other syndromes, leukemia, lymphoma, etc., which also present as acute liver failure. Liver transplant is definitely a no in that kind of situation. Children with transplants in acute liver failure do well. This is the King's College Group outcomes. This is transplant for all comers and chronic liver failure. It's upwards of sort of nearly 85% at about 14 years. Whereas in children who have got acute liver failure, it's not as good, but it's much better. It's better, and it's getting better as time passes. This is a study that came out from the transplant group in Birmingham. They had 97 children who had hepatic failure. 10 where hepatic transplant was contraindicated, was not offered. 32 got better, did not need transplant. 55 were assessed for transplant. Ultimately, 40 received it. But overall survival with availability of transplant where it was required was 61%, all comers. And survival without liver transplant was only 33%. So even now, even today, despite all the intensive care and all the understanding, survival with acute liver failure in children is pretty poor in the absence of liver transplantation. When a child with acute liver failure comes to you, what are your priorities of management? I think they might be slightly different than what it is in adults. There is no great rush to find etiology, because in about 50% of children you don't find an etiology. So spending too much time, money, and effort to try and nail an etiology is probably not very important. You try to find things that you can treat. For example, paracetamol, tyrosinemia, and galactosemia, etc., are conditions that are imminently treatable. So you look for these conditions. You look for conditions that will not benefit with liver transplant. For example, somebody has hemophagocytic syndrome or somebody who's got leukemia. You need to treat it differently, and you look for the diagnosis from that point of view. You're not trying to label what is causing this acute liver failure. So once you find out conditions that you can treat, conditions that will not benefit with liver transplant, you have deleted these two groups from transplantation. You then come to the remaining group, you try to stratify them and try to see if you can predict a need for transplant in that group. There are various ways to do it. These are the standard sort of King's College criteria. This is what causes this problem. Jaundice more than 7 days before encephalopathy. And when this encephalopathy happens, is very, very difficult to identify in children. I will skip this. This is important here because when you apply these formulae for children, there are a few problems. One, as I told you about hepatic encephalopathy, etiology is different, or the outcomes are different for different etiologies. So it's nice if you have etiology, then you can predict. But in children, since majority of them are indeterminate, prediction of outcomes on these scores are sometimes difficult. Studies have shown that it's a better predictor of 21-day survival when child does not fit this criteria. So if this criteria doesn't exist, then the child is likely to survive better. But the negative thing is not as good because it has a low sensitivity and a low positive predictive value. There have been other kind of data that has come. This is actually coming, where they have looked at basically prothrombin time encephalopathy and bilirubin to try and decide how many survive. But these are scores and stratification that I think will evolve as time passes. Essentially, I told you this has been our group, and I think this paracetamol toxicity is something that we need to think about, because it is something that we are likely to see more and more, because drugs are freely available across the counter here, any kind of drug. Of the 12 patients that we had, 7 recovered, and there were 5 deaths. The deaths were due to Wilson's disease in 2, antituberculous treatment in 1, and 2 children were cryptogenic, or we did not know the etiology of the liver failure. We did a brief study about how we can transplant these children. In our scenario, the thing was not very good. We had 6 children whom we considered for transplant with acute liver failure. 1 got transplanted, 1 recovered, but 4 we needed to transplant, but we couldn't. And a lot of them were because getting permissions and going through the legal framework, especially for children who are coming from outside the state, is very, very harrowing. So if there have to be take-home messages between pediatric and adult acute liver failure, what's the difference? In pediatric, coagulopathy is important. Most of them are indeterminate, and in India, infections are common causes of acute liver failure. There are significant number of correctable disorders that need to be corrected, so that's something that we need to look at. Encephalopathy assessment in children is very, very difficult, and management strategy is not to try and find a cause, but to weed out those that wouldn't need or will not benefit from transplant and treat them conservatively, and those that will benefit from transplant, think about transplant. So that is the general overall management strategy. Risk scores in children are poorly validated, and the commonest cause of death is cerebral edema rather than hemorrhage. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay Rao, for